Hilary Holladay. You are a biographer, novelist, poet, and scholar of modern and contemporary literature. You are the author of 5 books and you co-wrote 2 other ones. And your latest book is The Power of Adrienne Rich. Hilary, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Aline. I'm so happy to be here.
So, Hilary, as I told you a few minutes before, I'm just so upset that I only discovered you only a couple of weeks ago, and I see that I have been missing out on some great writing. And but here we are. I'm so happy to meet you, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about you, your background. I mean, you have been writing for a long time already. You have been teaching. Tell us what guided you into this profession.
Well, when I was growing up, I just always loved to read and write. My mother was a writer, a freelance writer, and I have 2 sisters, so the 3 of us pretty much all followed in our mother's footsteps. We all loved to write and to be creative. And my father was the math science guy in the household, so we learned lots from him too. Um, but yeah, I just always loved to create, and it seemed natural to go to college and major in English. And I've always loved to write poetry. And then when I went to graduate school, I got interested in modern and contemporary American literature. And so that eventually led me to write about women authors. I went to the University of Virginia as an undergraduate, and then to the College of William and Mary for my master's degree, and then to the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill for my PhD in English. And sort of sprinkled in among my grad school experiences, I was a newspaper reporter. And so when I decided that I really wanted to focus on biography, I was combining my interests in literary criticism and in truly beautiful American literature, and in journalism, because there is a strong element of journalism in writing a biography. You have to be willing to make cold calls, you have to be willing to go to your sources and interview them in person. And to be very scrupulous to make sure you're accurate in quoting people and getting the facts right. And I've always loved that. I've always loved journalism. So I guess that's a very short version of what led me into writing biography. It was a way to combine so many different threads of my interests into one.
Well, I tell you, I have been falling in love little by little with the English language. So I, in a way, envy your position in which your mother is a writer and your sisters are writer, and I see as very stereotypical that your father is into math.
Yes, that does sound very traditional, doesn't it? My father could quote poetry, he could quote passages from the Bible. Um, I give him credit too. So it was a wonderful thing growing up in a household where, um, I saw my parents reading a lot. And it does make a difference, I think, just what you see around you. And I had great teachers, I really did, all the way through school and into graduate school. And I had great mentors at the University of North Carolina.
So you said that you saw your parents reading a lot. Do you think that's something that we are kind of missing out nowadays in society when we have all these, I don't know, all these gadgets in our phones and all these? I mean, at one time we had what 500 TV channels. Now we have an infinite amount of TV on demand. So yeah, I'm afraid that the habit of reading and writing is slowly disappearing. How do you feel about that?
Well, I completely agree. I think that it's very important, not just for children to see their family members reading, but for those family members to be reading, for them to be reading books. Um, the internet, of course, is extremely seductive, and we're reading constantly. But we're reading material that isn't necessarily literature. It's usually quick news bites. And it can become very addictive, to read the news constantly on the screen, whether it's on, these days mostly on our phones. But there's something nice about reading a book and not being in that sort of interaction all the time. It's just you and the page, and you can think your thoughts and have a conversation in your head instead of this frenetic back and forth with people commenting on a thread of an article, for
Right.
instance.
And out of all the topics that you could focus on, I mean, I could see how you went into literature. It's hard not to fall in love with literature, but why in particularly woman authors?
Well, that's a good question. And I think um, I would say that when I was in college, I graduated from the University of Virginia in 1983, and I was only assigned a handful of women authors to read in college. And that's not a good thing. There's so many great women authors out there. And by the time I got to my PhD program, I had some great female professors. I was reading more women authors on my own. But I would say, to answer your question, it's important to address that imbalance. And and drawing on what Adrienne Rich said, that we want an accurate record of history and of literature. We don't want just a partial record. A partial record is to only validate the male authors. A complete record is to look at what everyone has written, to look at the great authors, male, female, of all races and ethnicities. That's a true picture of history. If we're only looking at what a portion of our population has written over time, then we're not learning as much. And it is important, just as it's important for men to have strong male role models, to know how men of previous generations have looked at the world and looked at relationships. It's also just incredibly important for women to know how women coming before them looked at the world. There is a commonality. Um, and when I decided I wanted to write about Adrienne Rich, it was in 2014. She had been dead for 2 years. And I was looking for a new subject. The previous author I had written about was a man. I haven't written just about women. But I thought, this time I want to write a biography about a woman. I want to write about a poet. I want to write about someone who was truly famous, more famous than Herbert Huncke, my previous subject. And I want to write about someone who was principled and truly wanted to change the world in a positive way. So, just truly by coincidence, there was Adrienne Rich, recently departed, and I was able to access her papers at Harvard University's Schlesinger Library. And then I was off and running. Also, a lot of people who knew her were still alive. Um, so I was able to interview a lot of her friends, colleagues, former students, people who simply admired her work, who were very prominent.
Okay, so you've been a writer for a while. You have written all these books. I'm going to ask you about the titles of them in a moment. But my question is, the barrier to entry into the writing profession, I see it from my ignorant point of view as quite low. All you had to do a few years, decades ago, was to have a typewriter. Now with a laptop and some internet connection, you can start becoming a writer. But I get the sense that there is some kind of gender discrimination in the field. Can you just rectify that in my mind? Is it, or is there not a gender discrimination as a writer?
Well, for a long time there was, and where it was particularly obvious to me was just in my education, that I kept being assigned books by men, primarily white men. And I'm not knocking white men at all. I'm glad I read all those books by great American and British authors, and some from other countries as well, great American, European male authors. Um, but what I saw was once I really started thinking about it, I thought, "No, wait a minute, where's the rest of the story?" So there's a pipeline of the publishers who accept the books that are popular, and the books that then are taught in the schools, all the way from elementary through the graduate school level. And you have to expand that pipeline. And now, and really for some years, there has been an effort to address that problem.
Mm.
And it's not like women authors haven't been published or haven't been read, because of course they have. But there's been a pervasive viewpoint for many years that the male authors somehow were just more important, and that the male viewpoint, and I'm borrowing from Adrienne Rich when I say this, that the male viewpoint was the quote unquote universal viewpoint, and the male world was the world. Um, so yes, it starts with having a typewriter or a computer and writing what you want to write, but you have to have connections on some level to get published. And for a long time, the male authors were the ones who were more likely to have those connections through people they had met when they were in college, or people they had met just through their life experience. Um, so certainly the imbalance is being addressed much more consciously now. And the imbalance is the focus currently in publishing is not so much, we need more women authors, it's we need more authors of color. And there is a real concerted push among the larger American publishers. I can't speak for elsewhere in the world to um, redress that imbalance.
Okay, so that's refreshing to know. So, I mean, I don't think it's a just society, but I think we are striving towards equality or justice or equal opportunities at least. Uh, you have been writing for a while, as I mentioned a few times already. Can you tell us some of the titles that you have written, and just one or two lines of what are they about?
Yes. The book that I published before the biography of Adrienne Rich was about a man called Herbert Huncke. And so the title of that book is Herbert Huncke, the Times Square hustler who inspired Jack Kerouac and the Beat Generation. Huncke was just that. He was a thief, an addict, a hustler. And when Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs were looking for inspiration for their works, it happened that they were acquainted with Huncke, and they were middle class guys. Huncke had started life middle class, but had descended into this um, underworld experience in New York. He helped them find material to write about because he introduced them to all these wild characters. He happened to also be a good writer. So I wrote about him because his life was so wild and fascinating, and because I admired his writing. So that's Hunky. Another book I wrote is called Wild Blessings, the Poetry of Lucille Clifton. And that's more of an academic book than the Hunky biography or the Adrienne Rich biography. Lucille Clifton was a brilliant African American poet who wrote about women's experiences, Black people's experiences, and her own personal life. And if you or your listeners are not familiar with Lucille Clifton, I really think you would love her. A lot of her poems are brief and very powerful. Uh, and I also published a novel called Tipton, Tipton. And that was a fun book to write. I've spent so much time doing scholarly research and biographical writing, but Tipton is a novel about young people coming of age before and during World War II. And it starts out in Oklahoma and it ends up in Orange County, Virginia, where my family roots are and where I currently live. I also published a collection of poetry called The Dreams of Mary Rowlandson. Mary Rowlandson was a colonial woman who lived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony and was captured by Indians. And after she was released, she wrote what considered America's first bestseller. It's a really interesting narrative of her experience in captivity. So my book is a series of poems uh, reflecting my view of what it must have been like for her. And then finally, my first book is called Ann Petrie, and that's a study of the African American novelist and short story writer Ann Petrie, who was also a New Englander. And she's also quite wonderful and brilliant, and I highly recommend her first novel called The Street. So that's an academic book meant to be accessible, as all my books are for a general readership. But it
Thank
was,
you.
yeah, so that's it.
Perfect. Okay, so Adrienne Rich was dead already 2 years when you decided to write about her life. And of course, digging a little bit, I discovered she was an activist and feminist, and she had like pages and pages of works that she had published and prizes that she had earned. Can you tell us in a nutshell about her life? Who was she? Why was she so important? What was the thing that made her special among the millions of other poets?
Well, Adrienne Rich um, started life as a rather privileged person. Her father was a prominent pathologist at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and he wanted his older daughter. He and his wife had two daughters, and those were the children in the family. He wanted his older daughter to be a genius of a writer. He loved to write. He was an amateur musician. He was a genius himself, and so he pushed and pushed Adrienne to develop her talents as a writer. She also wanted that success. She was naturally gifted, extraordinarily smart. And so in her early life, she was following her father's wishes and her own, sort of like a child prodigy in tennis, someone who's great at tennis and has a parent who's pushing them, go play more and play more. Then so to answer your question more directly, she was a great traditional poet, someone who had a good reputation in the 1950s and 60s. Then, when the great changes started happening in the US in the 60s and 70s, the civil rights movement, of course, started before the 60s, but it really became a big public phenomenon in the 60s. Adrienne got caught up in it, um, and she saw that she had essentially been used as a token, that the male members of the literary world had wanted her to succeed just so they could have one female member of the club. Um, and so she said, no, that's not how it's going to be. So she broke from writing traditional formal verse with, perfect meter and rhymes to writing much more experimental poems. So why was she so important? She was important because she decided, I'm going to speak as a woman. I'm going to speak, you know, in a few years after she came out as a lesbian. As a lesbian, I'm going to speak out as a Jew. I'm not going to hide who I am. And I'm not going to let anyone, whether it's my father or whether it's poetry critics or anyone else, tell me what I'm going to write or what I should write. And her decisions and the eloquence of her message in both her poetry and her prose had a huge impact on her readers and the people who came to her poetry readings and her lectures in the 60s on through to the time of her death. And I'm speaking especially about women, I'm speaking especially about gay men and lesbians. She had her example of courage as a writer and a citizen was of enormous impact.
So nowadays, when someone says, I'm gay, I'm lesbian, I doesn't, people don't think about it twice. I mean, at least in my city where I live, Montreal, it's just like, so what?
Yeah.
Uh, but but in her time, what was it like to come out as a lesbian? And did she uh, face any criticism by society, any pushback, any critiques for her sexual preferences?
Well, to your first question, what was it like for her to come out as a lesbian? I would say, on the one hand, it was extraordinarily invigorating for her. She felt like she was coming into her own. And there was a lesbian community, a lesbian feminist community that welcomed her with open arms, and considered her a leader, you know, a heroine of the feminist movement, in particular the lesbian feminist movement. So all that was great. I mean, of course, there were interactions that weren't always happy or positive, as there are in any sort of movement or group. But I think it was for her very much life affirming. On the other hand, though, it was very difficult. And she got a lot of pushback from people who knew her personally or knew her writing when she had been a proper married to a man woman. They didn't like it. I mean, the prejudice is so deeply ingrained. And um, for instance, there was one newspaper that said they couldn't publish the word lesbian in their paper. So, you know, if that's what she wanted to mention, then that kind of ended the interview right there. And there were literary critics who, in just kind of sneaky ways, made it clear in their reviews of her work that they weren't comfortable with that part of who she was. Um, and it was just pervasive. It was very hard in that time, and for unfortunately for so many people, um, I mean, I think it's hard it's hard no matter what your sexuality is, but to to announce it in her time, especially when she was prominent, was a big deal, and it was not at all easy or fun.
So she was also a feminist, and the definition of feminism continues shifting all the time. So one day of being a feminist is one thing, and 5 years before it was completely something different. So can you tell us what was feminism uh, at her time? What was the feminist movement fighting for at that time?
Well, Adrienne Rich wanted to look at the world truly through her own woman's eyes. There's been talk for many years in the literary world about the so-called male gaze, you know, that the male gaze looks at the world and sees it a certain way. And so for Rich and for her contemporaries in what was initially called the women's liberation movement, later feminism, and later still sometimes simply the women's movement, the idea was, hey, let's look at the world through our own eyes. Let's not, you know, put on a pair of male glasses. Um, so I think that's really the root of it, to consider um, the history of women's experience, to think about what it really feels like to be a woman, to be in a woman's body that's capable, for most women, of having babies, you know, the gift of that, the miracle of that, and also the responsibilities, the burdens that come with being able to have children, the vulnerabilities of being, you know, of having to think twice about whether you're going to walk down a street at night by yourself or even with a female friend or a companion, and the strengths that come from a woman's vision. So the idea was, let's have a woman-centered view of the world and of our relationships with others. Let's not always just assume that men are right, and let's not have men patronize us. Let's not have men treat us like we're little kids when we're fully grown adults.
Wow. And how about her Judaism? I mean, it seems like being a Jew is normal. What was abnormal of being a Jew or coming out as a Jew at in her time as well?
Well, you're touching on really the crucial parts of her experience. And a lot of it had to do, in that case, with the way that she was brought up. Her father was Jewish, her mother was not. Her father, as I said earlier, was a brilliant man, but he was held back in his career um, because of anti Semitism.
Mm.
And although it was not spoken of in the Rich household, Adrienne knew it, and later on, colleagues of her father discussed that with her. So she saw her own father held back um, because of his ancestry, his Jewish heritage. He did not practice Judaism. He did not want his children to identify as Jews. So she was brought up in this kind of strange world where she knew her father was Jewish. She knew that because of being his daughter, that if she had been in Europe during World War II, that she could have been sent to a concentration camp. Um, so when she decided to come out as a Jew, and it was a real coming out, just as it was for her to come out as a feminist or as a lesbian, it really was a big deal. Here is someone who was born in 1929 and who somewhat belatedly realized what had happened to the Holocaust victims. Um, And so it was part of just her embracing her identity. I don't think that once she came out as a Jew that she was subject to a great deal of discrimination because of that. It was more her saying, I stand with you. I am a Jew. I accept that part of my identity. Whatever vulnerabilities come with being a Jew in this world, I accept and embrace.
So many facets of her life. So, a young person who reads her work today, what could be some of the lessons that they could take from her vision and apply it to their life today?
Well, I would say that um, the first lesson is um, we all decide what our own educations are going to look like. And that can begin at a young age. Um, and I think that in her writing, in her poetry, and in her prose, she embodies what it means to be a searcher, a seeker, and an intellectual explorer of the world. We can't give up. We can't stop learning. Our mission in life has to always be about seeking, exploring, learning about human relationships and connections, and learning about the history of our own bodies, our own communities, our own world, our own universe. Um, to me, that's the first lesson of Adrienne Rich. The second, for people young, middle aged, old, who truly appreciate poetry, here is someone who dedicated her entire life to this art form. We're not talking about somebody who was just dabbling in the art or who was doing it for money. This is someone who devoted her life to the art form. Here is a record of a woman who truly understood what poetry was all about. If you want to know what great 20th century American poetry is, read her verse, realize that some of those poems are going to be more accessible than others. Read the shorter ones, think about those. In my biography, I explain a number of her number of her poems as best I can, so they'll be perhaps more accessible. Um, so that's second. And then third, I would say the courage of her example in coming out in the various ways I've already discussed is also an important lesson, no matter who one is. Everyone feels like an outsider. And so there's something to be learned from the courage of someone who also felt that way, as most poets do, and didn't let that hold her back from doing accomplishing so many goals in her life.
So, for someone who is not familiarized with her work, and let's say I want to, after this conversation, buy a book or an essay by Adrienne Rich, which one would you suggest? Which one would you suggest for my listeners to go out and buy to get familiarized with her style of writing?
I would say there's you could certainly buy a volume of selected poems or the collected poems, but I would say to buy the volume titled Diving into the Wreck. Diving into the Wreck came out in 1973, and it's uh, it shows Rich at the peak of her powers in the middle period of her career. And that title poem, Diving into the Wreck, is truly gorgeous. So I would say start with Diving into the Wreck um, in the poetry. Then another poetry collection called The Dream of a Common Language would be another great one to read. I think sometimes reading selected volumes, you sort of dip into someone's work and you get a little bit of a feel for it, but it can be more interesting just to see how the poet wanted her work to be read in a particular year. As for essays, I would say her book of Woman Born um, is another great one to look at. That came out in 1976, and that's where she's talking about um, just the responsibilities and burdens that women face who choose to be mothers.
Wow. I wonder if there's any questions I neglected to ask you, if there is any particular point that you would like to elaborate more on.
Well, I would say this. Adrienne Rich hasn't been gone that long. I mean, it was 8 years ago, well, now 9 years ago, that she died. And yet there are a lot of people who are not familiar with her. And I would say our cultural memory, unfortunately, is pretty short. And we have so much being thrown at us all the time. But I think just in general, it's important to um, go back and look at authors who are relevant today. I mean, her messages about human rights and about facing the fact that there's so much violence in the world are messages that certainly are important for us to think about today. And she goes into depth. I mean, this is not a soundbite type of author. If we can slow down and read Adrienne Rich, there's so much to be learned, and it can be calming. It can be calming to read a great poet and essayist.
So you just mentioned there's so much being thrown at us every day. There's new authors, new the advertising machine is huge. How do we discover? I mean, I'm so lucky I discovered you and to you, Adrienne Rich. How would I go about discovering other of these? They are not forgotten, but maybe they are not like in front of our face, so they are not perhaps not first choice for a person who is looking for something to read.
Well, um, sometimes I look at a website that's produced by the Poetry Foundation, poetryfoundation.org, and that's a tremendous resource. And you can find good essays and samples of poetry by, I don't know how many poets they have on record on that site, but that's a great place to go. And you can search for women poets, or you can search under different categories. You can browse through it. So since we're all on our computers all the time anyway, I think that's a fair enough place to start if you're looking for a writer of a certain, of a certain type that you want to research or read for pleasure. I also think, um, reading mainstream newspapers at least is a starting point for finding out about new books. More specialized publications are also useful, smaller journals, and they can be hard to find unless you really identify with a particular community. Um, for instance, there's the Gay and Lesbian Review, which focuses on, it's a book, primarily a book review publication, and that focuses on books um, written about gay and lesbian authors. So people who are looking for, they're thinking, boy, I would like to read more books by lesbians, for instance, or gay men. They can look at specialized publications. I also think um, just browsing, just word of mouth, just having, keeping up with friends, with, if you're in touch with professors, then it's useful just to find out what your friends are reading.
Right. Okay. Well, my last question, Hilary, please tell us where, one more time, the title of the book, and where can people follow you?
Well, the title of the book is The Power of Adrienne Rich, a biography. And I do want to mention my publisher, Nan Talese, at Doubleday. And I want to just thank Nan for accepting my book and publishing it. She is now retired. My biography of Adrienne Rich was the last book that she published at Doubleday after a truly amazing, wonderful career there. As for where you can follow me, well, I'm not really on social media. So you can follow me by listening to your podcast and keeping an eye out for other media appearances. So thank you so much. I love chatting with you.